Deborah, can you hear me? They can. So should I start? Okay, thank you. I'll begin. Thanks. Well, thank you very much for thanks for the invitation to speak to you. I'm very sorry I can't be there in person, and I'm also very sorry that I've missed out on the conversations so far. I think the conference is aptly named the 1,000 Names of Gaia, for names are what we are still arguing about. Just checking, making sure that you can hear me. Is the volume all right? Yeah. Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you. The names are what we are still arguing about because in part, we cannot quite name that which we are naming. For instance, climate change or global warming, the Anthropocene, or plain old capitalism, or capitalocene as some have called it. Or you can also look at the necessary play of metaphors in Lovelock's texts that Bruno Latour has already drawn our attention to, and I'm grateful to Bruno for having sent me the lecture he gave in Rio. So these are names without pin-downable references or reference, which itself must suggest something about the times we're living in. There is a general sense of crisis, not a specific sense of crisis like a crisis of business cycle or capitalist accumulation of wealth, a depression, a stagflation, an inflationary spiral, but something larger. And the problem seems to be that different scholars have different ideas about what is at stake in defining the crisis. Hence the passion that informs the debates about naming the source of our sense of crisis. In the time given to me, I would like to focus on one particular debate that concerns scholars who speak of a new geological epoch, the Anthropocene, and between people who actually speak in favor of this naming this new epoch, the Anthropocene, and those who consider the name redundant or a misnomer, because they think that the geological epoch of humans that the word Anthropocene seeks to capture mistakenly names humans, the anthropos, as the icon of the age, while it is the pursuit of the inequities of capitalism that has produced this crisis, this unnamed crisis we face. And if this has indeed landed us in a new geological epoch, the epoch should be named, as some have suggested, Capitalocene, or something like that. So, in the interest of this debate and furthering it, what I'll try to do is to produce what I hope will be a friendly critique of a paper that Andreas Malm, or Malm, however you say the Swedish name, and Alf Hornborg wrote together for the journal The Anthropocene Review of March 18, 2014, published online in January. And the paper was called The Geology of Mankind, ? A critique of the Anthropocene narrative. So, Malm and Hornborg, they read the Anthropocene hypothesis primarily as a causal hypothesis. In other words, they read it, the name itself, as explaining what has brought a new geological period about. So they read the scientists as asking this question, what caused the Anthropocene? And then answering it by naming the period itself as Anthropocene, and also finding that Anthropocene began with the invention of the steam engine by James Watt. The criticism is that theorists of the epoch, the scientists who talk about the Anthropocene, have little to say, I'm quoting, about the actual causes of the rise of steam, but they do propound a general framework for understanding the transition to fossil fuels in the Industrial Revolution, which is deduced from human nature. So in some ways, they read these scientists as arguing that if we have come into a new geological epoch called the Anthropocene, the epoch has to be so named because all of humans, the species, has been responsible for bringing it about. And therefore they think that the scientific argument about the geology of mankind must have its roots in the properties of this being. So I'm quoting them. So this becomes a narrative of the entire species, the Anthropos as such ascending to biospheric supremacy. So the Anthropocene becomes the same as the story of human evolution. Hence, their caution is that by thinking about Anthropocene, we must not abandon the fundamental concerns of social science, which importantly include the theorization of culture and power. So critically, they say that attempts to attribute climate change to the nature of human species, in other words, arguing from the premise that the scientists have argued that climate change, which they equate to Anthropocene, has been brought about by the Anthropos itself. This, they think, is an argument that is doomed to vacuity. What kind of vacuity? And they say it's as vacuous as, I'm quoting, explaining the success of the Japanese fighter pilots in terms of the fact that we humans evolved binocular visions and opposable thumbs. Instead, what they propose is a general, unexceptionable history of capitalism and its asymmetric exchanges. But in concluding, they granted that the scholars who are talking about the Anthropocene, even if they're naturalizing climate science, they're not necessarily working on behalf of vested interests, but they are still very mistaken in the view of Malm and Hornberg, and their idea is misconceived. So they end by saying if global warming is the outcome of the knowledge of how to light a fire, or some other property of the human species acquired in the distant stage of its evolution, how can we imagine a dismantling of the fossil economy? In other words, their point is that not only is the idea misconceived, the idea also does not leave us with any way of acting on the problem it diagnoses. And therefore they say, I hope with some sense of humor, they say the Anthropocene might be a useful concept and narrative for polar bears and amphibians who want to know which species is wreaking such havoc on their habitats. But alas, they lack the capacity to stand up to human actions. Within human kingdom, species thinking on climate change is conducive to mystification and political paralysis. So the ultimate argument is that if we think not so much or think not of capitalism, but about the human species and what it's done, then it leads to mystification and political paralysis. And therefore, they argue that the Anthropocene, I'm quoting, is an ideology, more by default than by design. But as an ideology, it blinkers your vision, it stops you from seeing what you should be seeing. And more the product of the dominance of natural science in the field of climate change, and perhaps the general blunting of critical edges and narrowing of political horizons in the post-1989 world than of any malicious apologetics. But they conclude the idea of the Anthropocene and the Anthropocene story is analytically defective and inimical to action. Now, what I want to do is to actually somewhat defend the idea of Anthropocene and point out what I find problematic about the argument that Malm and Hornberg have put together. Now, it is a basic principle. I don't know why they think that people who argue about the Anthropocene must argue about a fixed human nature. It's a basic principle of evolutionary studies that species have no intrinsic nature. Otherwise, there would be no thesis about natural selection. So why would our scientists not know this very basic point? And why would they want to argue from such a wrong premise? So I think what they don't grant is, in their reading of the Anthropocene narrative, is the possibility of other kinds of interpretations of the point that the Anthropocene theorists are making. So, in some ways, this may be a debate about scholars typically talking past one another. So what if we thought about Anthropocene not as a causal explanation for climate change? Because, I mean, when you name a geological period, the name of the period doesn't have to explain how it came about. So when you call a period Holocene, which means the recent times, the name doesn't have to explain what climatic changes were caused the Holocene and what were the causes of those climatic changes. So instead, I think it's more useful to think of the Anthropocene as a thought experiment in geological periodization, because, I mean, it's not yet an official category, it doesn't have a formal status, it's going through certain processes, it might even be rejected, who knows. That process doesn't even start until 2016. So the proponents of Anthropocene, it seems to me Paul Crutzen, Eugene Stormer, Jan Zalasiewicz, Will Steffen and others, thought the problem of climate change, defined by the warming of the planet's average surface temperature, caused mainly by social emissions of greenhouse gases, they thought that the problem of climate change spoke not only of the geological force that humans were collectively capable of exercising in terms of determining the climate of the whole planet, but that climate change also spoke of a new geological epoch that future geologists would be able to identify from the stratal evidence, that the evidence of the strata, available to them in millions of years from now. So, I mean, this comes out very clearly in the book that the geologist Jan Zalasiewicz wrote, which is called The World After Us. So where he imagines some alien geologist coming to the planet and looking at the stratal evidence. And his question is, will future geologists find enough stratal evidence to show that human beings have a significant geological impact on the planet? So the question behind Anthropocene was not so much a way, I think, not so much about determining a cause for climate change, but more actually about a typically geologist question, whether a new geological epoch could be defined with the and that's what I think the subcommittee set up by the Strategic Commission in London is trying to do. But the expression Anthropocene has become popular, even though it doesn't enjoy any formal status. It expresses a hypothesis still to be debated, tested, accepted, or rejected. It became popular because it connoted to the untrained ear something big, significantly big, to be of interest to geologists, and thus conveyed the sense of a very big change that was upon us. Excuse me. In its popular usage, Anthropocene means the age of humans, but not in the strict sense that its proponents wanted to give the term. Scholars who thought up the word in the context of their discussions of climate change actually read the more limited proposition that human beings were capable of having the impact on the planet, the same kind of impact on the planet's climate as tilts in the orbital plane of the climate could. They read that more limited proposition as symptomatic of some larger change in the planet's geological history. We will return to the question of what may have been at stake for them in making this proposition. But clearly the word anthropos, embedded in the expression Anthropocene, is what made many scientists, and social scientists and humanists, including the two authors I'm describing, uncomfortable. Why inscribe all humans into a name that speaks of something as grave as climate, changing the climate of the planet, when greenhouse gases were emitted mostly by industrial and newly industrializing nations, with huge differences between them in terms of per capita emissions? I mean, after all, it's well known that only 1/5 of humanity, and about 13 or 14 nations, China and India among them, do most of the emitting. and therefore they argue that Anthropocene is an ideology. Now, here are the problems that I find with their propositions again. Climate scientists who use the word Anthropocene, or who talk about the geological agency of humans, normally are perfectly aware of the fact that not all humans are equally responsible for greenhouse gases. I mean, the proposal to calculate emissions on a per capita basis has been around since 1991, when two Indian environmentalists, Sunita Narayan and Anil Agarwal, proposed it in a booklet, which was so titled as to think of global warming as a case of colonialism, and was accepted as part of the Kyoto Protocol of 1997. And if you look at books written by climate scientists on climate change in the 2000s, in this century, you will find that many of them actually cite the per capita figures and are very critical of the energy-guzzling lifestyles of developed industrial nations. So they could not have used the expression anthropogenic climate change to obscure the fact that not all humans were equally responsible, for they cite these facts themselves. The only conclusion we can come to is that the word anthropogenic does not mean that the entire species is responsible for climate change. It does not mean that all the members of the human species are equally responsible. The word is there to signal the point that while the climate of the planet has changed in the past, without humans playing any significant role in it, this time around, some human institutions have had a major role in the emission of greenhouse gases. It is to distinguish this episode of climate change of the planet from other previous changes to the planet's climate that they use the word anthropogenic. Nobody has claimed that it refers to the whole of humanity. That is actually a very literal reading of the word. And something I will have to say about this critique of the Anthropocene is in many ways its literalness. Similarly, that capitalism or industrial civilization is positively correlated with global warming or climate change is not at issue. I think nobody argues that they're not connected or that this is not an efficient cause or approximate cause. Both Crutzen's reference to the steam engine and the paper on the Great Acceleration by Stephen Crutzen and McNeil that came out more recently, probably around 2009 in Ambio, which actually talked about the post-Second World War world ratcheting up the emissions by going for both industrialization and eventually a consumerist capitalism. So in all their positions, there's an acknowledgement of the role that modern industrial economy plays. But the problem here in reducing climate change to capitalism are of two kinds. One is, I think, if you make capitalism the culprit, and if capitalism has a role to play, you also have to explain the appeal of capitalism globally. Why did countries such as India and China, that both began their post-independence and post-revolution journeys, pursuing different forms of non-capitalist developments, why would they want to be part of the global capitalist economy? In India, why would they want to be part of this path of development in spite of having had a person like Gandhi? Can capitalism be its own explanation? Why does capitalism succeed? Why are African leaders today wanting to join the global economy? Now we can produce a variety of forms of circular reasoning, all running around the proposition that people want capitalism because capitalists or their representatives make them want it. Then one could ask how or why did the originators of the capitalist mode, the first group, got infected by the bug? And could some of the factors at work in their case be factors in later human history as well? And by definition, they would have to be factors outside of the logic of capital, something that is non-capital. So does something outside the logic of capital repeat itself always when we see the beginnings of capitalist relations in any particular part of the world? And what could it be? Now, obviously, I cannot answer it, but I'm simply making the point that as a history of desires, capitalism cannot account for it. Because capitalism was not like, the story of the three primary Indian godheads, who emerged from an even more primary shape, an egg, actually, of the godhead itself. So there's a Sanskrit word, swayambhu. You have to argue that capitalism originated from itself, or the desire for capitalism originates from capitalism, which would be a very circular form of reason. But where I think the reduction of climate change to capitalism and the refusal to think of anything bigger, like species question, creates a problem, it's really with the question of population. Now, Malm and Horberg declare with some aplomb, citing the research of Chakrabarty, that there's no correlation, looking at the data between 1980 and 2005, between population growth and the growth of emissions. In other words, where population grew fastest, emissions grew the slowest. And they go on to say, if a correlation is negative, causation is not the question. But that is not surprising at all, because population has grown in the relatively less developed countries. Indian population increased by more than 4 times in the last 60 years, in regions where most people are still poor, and the poor do not emit much greenhouse gases. That stands to reason, but that is not the end of the population question. The reason why China and India are today in the club of big polluters is not because their per capita emissions are high, but because the scale of populations, their economies, but because of the scale of population, their economies have to serve. And going forward, at least with regard to climate change and emissions, population is going to be a very big factor. Now, population growth is connected to fossil fuels. It's connected to medicine, public health, but it's also connected to fertilizers, irrigation, and the production of more food. So fossil fuels have contributed to our growth in numbers. But an exponential increase in population, which is what we have had in the last 50, 60, 70 years, an exponential increase in population must have been a significant factor in our having become a dominant species. Now I'm assuming that we're a dominant species is not in doubt in terms of the pressures we are exerting on other species. So one important question that arises is, did capitalism make us the dominant species? Or did capitalism accelerate a certain process that was already on of our having become a dominant species? If the latter, in other words, if you accept the proposition that it was not just capitalism that made us dominant species, but capitalism may have accelerated the process of our becoming a dominant species, then a longer term history is also an issue. Because we could not have become a dominant species without the long history of the development of the human brain, for instance. This is the history of us as a species. So the question of being a dominant species thus actually brings together 2 different histories. The history of industrial and fossil fuel-based modernity, and the long history of human evolution. Bringing the 2 histories together does not mean that the longer history is a cause in the same sense that the more short-term contextual factors might be. So go back to Malm and Hornberg's criticism, where they said that to take the long-term history as cause would be as implausible as explaining the success of the Japanese fighter pilots in terms of the fact that pre-humans developed binocular visions and opposable thumbs. I agree. But on the other hand, if our evolutionary history had been different, say we did not have binocular vision and opposable thumbs, surely we would have had to design fighter planes differently. It's simply that fact that in designing fighter planes, we took our evolutionary history for granted. So here the long history, even if it is not a contextually operative cause, is definitely a part of the context. So my point is that species history or species thinking does not involve us in assuming that, in arguing from the nature of species, and in that sense, when I wrote my article, which they criticized, on the climate of history, I did not consciously use the word species in the sense that young Marx used it, for instance, in the 1844 manuscripts, where he actually talked about species being. Because I argued, like many others do, that species don't have a being. There is no essential nature to species. So species history does not cancel, nor does it cancel out the history of capitalism. But what one has to understand that these are histories that operate at different levels of analysis. The archives are different. The research methods are different. The way we prove a point are different. So one is talking about different levels of analysis, participating in the institutions of capitalism, if only as its victims, does not stop us from being members of a species, and therefore also being participants in the shared evolutionary history of humans. The latter, in turn, cannot be understood without taking into account the history of the climate of the planet, because evolution has often depended on climatic changes and changing climates, which have played a part in the evolution. But the changing climates of the planet cannot be understood without referring back to Earth history and geological, the history of the geology of this planet, which is precisely the literature that the proponents of the Anthropocene were directed to, right? So I actually find it much more useful to think about these as conjoined histories, a crisis that suddenly makes visible the conjoining of different kinds of histories that move at different speed, that occur at different levels of analysis. In other words, histories that you can only perceive and analyze at different levels of abstraction. For instance, it happens all the time in medical problems. I mean, if you have diabetes and you go to a doctor, I mean, before you have diabetes, you don't think about your body. But if you have diabetes, you go to your doctor and you read some medical stuff for diabetes and you realize that you're actually dealing with a body that has been formed by a much longer history of hunting, gathering, and other kinds of labor in an age in which, where the lifestyles of many of us have become sedentary. So it's the crisis of diabetes that actually makes visible the long-term history alongside the short-term history. Similarly, it's the crisis of climate change that makes visible the short-term history of capitalism alongside the longer-term history of species or the history of the planet. Now, I said that the one problem I had with their criticism is the literalness of their readings, either of the Anthropocene proposition or of my essay. And I'll just give you an example of, I'll answer some of their criticism of my essay, and then I'll try to make something of the problem of literal reading. I mean, this flat literal reading. I think it's a more significant point. That's simply the point that things have been read literally. I think there's a more intellectual, the deeper point of issue, and I'll end with it. So, Malm and Hornberg's criticism of my essay, The Climate of History, turns out the proposition that even though I reflect on some pitfalls of species thinking, I ended up endorsing a project of thinking that takes thinking about species seriously. And then they claim that I had said humanity really, I'm quoting, humanity really is constituted as a universal species agent that flashes up in a moment of danger, etc., etc. Now, they don't say this, they may be aware of it, they may not be aware of it. I was in talking it together in a sentence of negative universal, something I was calling negative universal history, and the flashing up in a moment of danger, which was Benjamin. I was trying to gesture to the problem of the universal that I also said could not be an identity like humanity, and spend some words trying to explain why, as a species, we cannot feel ourselves into a species being, and why species simply was a category of classification, often unstable, with no ontological side to it. Being a collectivity defined as a species is something that is not available to human experience. Yet I wanted to think about it. Think about it because climate change is a problem that invariably raises not only the question of the commons, and I take on board all the critical remarks that Latour made on the idea of the commons, but it also questions about being in common. It raises questions about being in common. The Kyoto Protocol talked about common but differentiated responsibility that we all bear with regard to climate change and with regard to fixing the problem. Now, the expression differentiated responsibility clearly speaks to all that Malm and Hornberg identify as the villain of the piece, which is inequality, capitalism, the rich-poor, oppressor-oppressed distinctions. Granted. But what does the word common refer to? What does it mean to say that we have a common responsibility as well? Was common simply an empty term in the Kyoto Protocol, just a vacuous rhetoric, a bargaining tool, so that only differentiated had meaning and common did not? Latour in his lecture said, we are all in the same boat. What does that mean to say that we are all, what does it mean to say we are all in the same boat? So there is the question that comes up. The problem may be again in naming it, a question of commonness, something shared, that always comes up in discussions of climate change. And it is actually the less thought, the more underthought aspect of the problem. So I actually said that while climate change would accentuate the inequalities of capitalism, I did say that, it was still a problem for all, for even the rich nations and classes were not immune from it. And gave the example of serious bushfires in Australia, a rich nation by all standards, any standards, bushfires that actually killed people. In that context, I said there are no lifeboats here for the rich and the privileged. I stand by my statement that the rich and the privileged nations and classes are not immune to climate change. But Malm and Hornberg took the lifeboat analogy literally again and made a point that I had already made, that the poor will suffer more. They give the example of Katrina. I agree with them on that point. But that was not my point. I said that unlike in capitalist crisis, or in normal operations of capitalism where the rich could even make money off the sufferings of the least privileged, here is a crisis that affects us all, in a differentiated manner, no doubt, but all. Look at the list of cities threatened by sea level rise. They include my hometown of Calcutta, but also Sydney and New York. The temperature of Chicago in 50 years' time is predicted to be like that of cities in Texas, from where people, and while people from the south may migrate north. Would not that affect the city's rich? And if global warming were to become dangerous and affect the parametric conditions of human existence, it would seriously threaten us all. I still think that the word common, in that expression, common but differentiated responsibility, is really the underthought word in that expression. Finally, to solutions and actions. Of course, the thinking about species history or thinking about species or thinking about Anthropocene cannot offer any solutions to the present crisis, though they can inform our sense of the present and they can inform our sense of the human condition. But nor does blaming capitalism give us a quick fix on the climate problems, while again it informs our understanding. Seeing the source of our climate problems in the capitalist mode of production means that we can't solve the problem unless and until the problem of capitalism is addressed. And this runs up against, very interestingly, against a calendar that the fifth report of the IPCC actually presents us with. The fifth report of the IPCC creates a plausible figure for carbon budget. In other words, the argument is that if we want to avoid, that is the IPCC's position, what they call dangerous climate change, that is more than 2 degrees Celsius rise, then we have to spend all the carbon that we can, or we have to emit all the carbon that we want to emit in the next 25 years. Now, I know that the 2 degrees is an arbitrary figure. There are debates about that, and I know that many people argue that we'll definitely go well beyond 2 degrees, but just sticking to IPCC, that there is a global window of action that IPCC points to, which is the next 25 years. Now, there is no guarantee that capitalism will end in the next 25 years, nor can we work on that assumption. So one has to then work on other assumptions to actually get global action going. So let us then say that both capitalism, both the Anthropocene hypothesis and the capitalism hypothesis are more about understanding the cause and the nature of the many problems that we bring together under names like climate change, names like Anthropocene, names like Gaia, but they're not really about addressing it in the practical terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions that the IPCC recommends, for instance, which is why if you look at all the policy papers that are written from IPCC, they all take market economy for granted. Finally, I come to the question that I raised about literal reading. And I come to the problem that so troubles, and in their own word, disturbs. In fact, they began the paper by saying that they found it deeply paradoxical and disturbing. They found that the Anthropocene narrative disturbing. Why? Because in their reading, the Anthropocene narrative is symptomatic of the domination of the social sciences by the natural sciences. But in opposing the social to the natural, they come up with a form of debate that does not grant to those they oppose any plurality of meanings, the potential to be interpreted differently. So as I said, if you don't look on the Anthropocene narrative as providing you with a causal understanding of what causes Anthropocene, but actually as a way of naming a geological period, which is open to disputation among geologists, then you open up a different way of interpreting what they're saying. So what I find, the social science or the Marxism that I find in the argument opposed to the Anthropocene is one that seems to me to have had no contact with the humanities, with the heritage of philology and hermeneutics. There is so much in evidence otherwise in what Bruno Latour and others have diagnosed in the idea of Gaia, and done so precisely by drawing our attention to the play of metaphors in the writings of scientists, especially those of James Lovelock. Thank you very much. Thank you.